My wife was denied treatment. The doctor stammered, "Medical director, I had no idea she was your wife." Dr. Gregory Vance's face went from dismissive confidence to ash-white terror in the time it took my heart to skip one beat. He was standing in the doorway of examination room 4 at Metropolitan General Hospital's emergency department at 11:43 p.m. on a Saturday, still wearing the condescending smirk he'd had when he told my wife 15 minutes earlier that her pain was probably just anxiety and she should try relaxing at home with some chamomile tea. I wasn't wearing my hospital ID. I'd come straight from our house in jeans and a sweater, holding Claire's hand as she doubled over in agony, her face gray and slicked with sweat. The triage nurse had seen us, taken Claire's vitals, noted her elevated heart rate and blood pressure, and sent us to wait. We'd waited for 43 minutes while Claire's pain got worse, while she gripped my hand so hard I lost feeling in my fingers, while she tried not to scream because she didn't want to be dramatic. Then Dr. Vance had walked in, glanced at her chart for maybe 10 seconds, and made his diagnosis without examining her, without running tests, without doing anything except look at my 34-year-old wife and decide she was wasting his time. Now he stood frozen in the doorway staring at me with dawning recognition and horror because he'd just realized that the woman he'd dismissed was married to Dr. Michael Reeves, medical director of Metropolitan General Hospital, the person who oversaw every department including his, the person who had final say on physician performance reviews, credentialing, and disciplinary actions. I'd been medical director at Metropolitan General for 3 years when this happened, overseeing a 650-bed teaching hospital with 18 specialized departments and a medical staff of over 400 physicians. I was 41 years old, had spent 15 years in emergency medicine before transitioning into hospital administration, and had built my reputation on patient safety, quality improvement, and zero tolerance for substandard care. I reviewed mortality and morbidity cases, investigated patient complaints, implemented evidence-based protocols, and made sure every physician in my hospital understood that patients came first, always, without exception. My wife Claire was a high school art teacher, creative and empathetic, the kind of person who saw beauty in everything and believed the best about people. We'd been married for 8 years, together for 12, and she was the center of my world. She'd been experiencing abdominal pain off and on for 3 weeks, the kind that came in waves and left her breathless. She'd seen her primary care physician twice, been told it was probably gastritis or stress, been given antacids and told to avoid spicy foods. The pain had gotten worse over the past 2 days, sharper and more constant, radiating to her back. Tonight, it had become unbearable, stabbing pain that made her cry out, that sent her to her knees in our kitchen while I called 911. The ambulance had taken too long, so I'd driven her myself to Metropolitan General's emergency department, the hospital where I worked, where I knew every protocol and every standard of care, where I trusted my colleagues to treat patients with the urgency and respect they deserved. Dr. Gregory Vance was a 46-year-old emergency medicine physician who'd been on staff for 11 years. I knew him mostly through quality metrics and department meetings. Competent on paper, average performance reviews, no major disciplinary issues. I didn't know him personally, had never worked a shift with him, had no reason to think he was anything other than a solid emergency physician doing his job. Until tonight when he'd walked into that examination room, looked at my wife with undisguised impatience, and asked her what she really wanted from this visit. Claire had tried to explain the pain, the 3 weeks of worsening symptoms, the fact that her primary care physician's treatment wasn't helping. Vance had interrupted her twice, asking if she'd tried the antacids, if she'd considered that maybe she was stressed about something. His tone was patronizing, dismissive, like he was talking to a child who'd invented an ailment to get attention. I'd felt my jaw tighten but stayed quiet because I was trying to let Claire speak for herself, trying not to use my position to influence her care. Then Vance had said the thing that made my blood turn to ice. "Mrs. Reeves, I see dozens of young women every week with abdominal pain. 9 times out of 10, it's anxiety, stress, or period cramps blown out of proportion. Your vitals are fine. You don't have a fever. You're not presenting with acute abdomen signs. I think what you need is to go home, take some deep breaths, maybe talk to someone about stress management. The ER isn't the place for chronic complaints that should be handled by your primary care physician." He was sending her home, without examination, without imaging, without blood work, based on nothing except his assumption that young women with abdominal pain were hysterical or attention-seeking. That's when I'd stood up and said his name. Just said it, quietly. "Dr. Vance." He'd looked at me for the first time, really looked, and I'd watched recognition dawn across his face in stages. First, just a vague sense that he knew me, then confusion about why I looked familiar, then the horrible, stomach-dropping realization of exactly who I was. "Medical director," he'd stammered. I had no idea she was your wife." Not an apology, not a reassessment of his diagnosis, just shock that he'd dismissed the medical director's wife, as if Claire's symptoms only mattered because of who she was married to. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. "Does that change your clinical assessment?" I asked. My voice was level, controlled, the tone I used in disciplinary hearings when I wanted physicians to understand the gravity of their mistakes. Vance's face flushed. "No, of course not. I mean, I should have been more thorough. Let me order some tests. Blood work, imaging, we'll get a full workup. Based on what change in her presentation? I pressed. 30 seconds ago, you were sending her home with breathing exercises. Now you want a full workup. What changed medically? He didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Because nothing had changed except his awareness of who I was. Claire's pain was the same. Her symptoms were the same. The only variable was that he now knew dismissing her could cost him his career. I stood up, moved between Vance and my wife. Get Dr. Rachel Winters down here. Page her directly. Tell her I need a senior attending evaluation for my wife immediately. Vance nodded and practically ran from the room. Dr. Rachel Winters was the assistant director of emergency medicine, a physician with 23 years of experience who I trusted completely. She arrived within 8 minutes, took one look at Claire's condition, and her expression went grim. She performed a thorough examination, palpating Claire's abdomen carefully, noting the severe tenderness in the right upper quadrant and the positive Murphy's sign that Vance should have checked for and didn't. Michael, I'm ordering a stat ultrasound and comprehensive metabolic panel. Her presentation is concerning for acute cholecystitis, possibly with complications. She looked at Claire with compassion and professionalism. We're going to figure out what's going on and get you comfortable. I'm starting IV fluids and pain management now. The ultrasound confirmed Rachel's suspicion 23 minutes later. Claire had acute cholecystitis, inflammation of the gallbladder, with evidence of gallstones and possible perforation. Her gallbladder was severely inflamed, borderline rupture, a surgical emergency that required immediate intervention. If she'd gone home like Vance recommended, if the inflammation had progressed to perforation, she could have developed sepsis, peritonitis, possibly died. All because a physician had looked at a young woman in pain and assumed she was exaggerating or seeking attention. Rachel called in the on-call general surgeon, Dr. James Kepler, who had 31 years of experience and a reputation for excellence. He reviewed the imaging, examined Claire, and made the decision to take her to surgery within the hour. This is serious, he told us both. The gallbladder is severely diseased. We need to remove it before it ruptures. The surgery is straightforward, but the timing is critical. I held Claire's hand as they prepped her for surgery, watched them wheel her away at 1:15 a.m., and then I stood alone in the surgical waiting area trying to process what had almost happened. My wife had almost been sent home to die because a physician made assumptions based on her age and gender instead of doing his job. The rage that had been building in my chest since Vance's dismissal erupted into something cold and focused. I pulled out my phone and started making calls. First to the hospital's chief operating officer, Margaret Flynn, 62 years old, 38 years in healthcare administration. She answered on the third ring despite the late hour, listened to my account of what happened, and her response was immediate. I'll initiate a formal peer review investigation first thing Monday morning. This is exactly the kind of implicit bias we've been trying to address. Document everything, Michael. Every interaction, every timestamp, everything Vance said and did. Next, I called the hospital's risk management director, Thomas Aldridge, 54 years old, 26 years managing medical liability. You need to pull Vance's patient records for the past 6 months. I want to see how many other young women he's dismissed without proper workup. I want to know if there's a pattern. Thomas agreed immediately. I'll have a preliminary report ready by Monday afternoon. Then I called the hospital's chief medical officer, Dr. Patricia Lansing, 59 years old, former neurosurgeon, no-nonsense administrator who'd been recruited from Johns Hopkins to help improve our quality metrics. Patricia, I need you to review this case personally, not just for Vance's performance, but for systemic issues. If one physician feels comfortable dismissing patients this way, we have a culture problem. She didn't hesitate. I'll be there in 30 minutes. We'll review everything together. While I waited for Claire's surgery to finish, I started documenting. Wrote down every word Vance had said, every gesture, every dismissive expression, noted the timestamps, the lack of physical examination, the assumptions he'd made, pulled up the emergency department's electronic health record and reviewed the documentation he'd entered in Claire's chart. It was minimal, cursory, basically useless. Patient presence with chronic abdominal pain, denies fever, vomiting, acute symptoms, counseled on stress management and appropriate use of emergency services, discharged home with instructions to follow up with PCP. Except he hadn't discharged her. He'd been interrupted by my presence before he could complete that documentation. If I hadn't been there, if Claire had been just another patient without connections, that discharge note would have been finalized and she'd be home right now with a gallbladder on the verge of rupture. The surgery took 2 hours and 23 minutes. Doctor. Kepler came to the waiting room at 3:38 a.m., looking tired but satisfied. The gallbladder was gangrenous, completely inflamed, about 6 hours away from perforation based on the tissue condition. We removed it laparoscopically. No complications. She'll be in recovery for an hour, then moved to a surgical floor bed. She should be able to go home in 2 to 3 days. I felt my knees go weak with relief. Thank you, James. Thank you for taking her seriously. He gave me a sharp look. Rachel told me what happened with Vance. That's unacceptable, Michael. I don't care who the patient is or who they're related to. That kind of dismissal has no place in medicine. Dr. Lansing arrived while Claire was in recovery. We sat in a conference room reviewing the case timeline and Vance's documentation. Her expression grew darker with each detail. This is negligence. Clear, documented negligence. He made a diagnosis without examination, without appropriate differential diagnosis, without following standard of care protocols for acute abdominal pain. She pulled up the hospital's clinical guidelines for abdominal pain assessment. Look at this. Our own protocols require physical examination, pain assessment scale, and consideration of serious pathology before attributing symptoms to anxiety or stress. Vance violated every single guideline. I showed her the note he'd started to write. She read it twice, then closed her laptop. I'm suspending him pending investigation, effective immediately. He doesn't see another patient until we've completed a full peer review. I spent the next 3 days at the hospital while Claire recovered. She was groggy from anesthesia the first day, in pain, but managing with medication the second day, and by the third day, she was alert enough to process what had happened. Michael, that doctor really thought I was making it up, didn't he? I sat on the edge of her hospital bed, holding her hand. He made assumptions instead of doing his job. That's on him, not you. She was quiet for a moment. How many other women has he done this to? How many people got sent home who shouldn't have been? That was exactly the question I'd been asking. On Monday, Thomas Aldridge delivered his preliminary risk management report. He'd pulled 6 months of Dr. Vance's patient encounters, filtered for female patients aged 18 to 45 with abdominal pain complaints. The results were damning. Vance had seen 83 female patients in that age range with abdominal pain over 6 months. Of those 83, he'd ordered imaging or lab work for 31, a rate of 37%. We compared that to his male patients in the same age range with abdominal pain. He'd seen 41 male patients, ordered testing for 34, a rate of 83%. The disparity was statistically significant and clinically indefensible. Thomas had also identified 4 formal complaints filed against Vance in the past year, all from female patients who felt their symptoms had been dismissed. One woman had returned to the ER 12 hours after Vance sent her home, diagnosed with appendicitis by a different physician. Another had been dismissed with probable anxiety, later diagnosed with ovarian torsion at a different hospital. A third had been told her chest pain was probably panic attacks, subsequently diagnosed with pericarditis. The complaints had been logged, reviewed by Vance's department director, and essentially dismissed as difficult patients or communication issues. No investigation, no pattern recognition, no intervention. I read through those complaint files with mounting fury. The system had failed these women repeatedly, not just Vance, but the entire oversight structure that should have caught this pattern and stopped it. The peer review investigation began Monday afternoon. Dr. Lansing assembled a committee of 5 physicians, none from the emergency department, to avoid conflicts of interest. They reviewed Vance's cases, his documentation patterns, his testing rates, his patient outcomes. They interviewed nurses who'd worked with him, reviewed patient satisfaction scores, examined everything. On Wednesday, the committee delivered their findings. Dr. Vance demonstrated a clear pattern of gender bias in his clinical decision-making, consistently dismissing or minimizing symptoms in female patients while taking identical complaints from male patients seriously. His documentation was substandard, his physical examinations frequently inadequate or absent, and his diagnostic reasoning showed dangerous shortcuts and assumptions. The committee recommended immediate termination and reporting to the state medical board for professional misconduct. Dr. Lansing called a meeting with me, Margaret Flynn, the hospital's legal counsel, and the chief of emergency medicine. We sat in a conference room reviewing the committee's report and the legal implications. The legal counsel, Andrew Berkowitz, a partner at a prominent healthcare law firm with 29 years of experience, laid out the risks. This creates significant liability exposure. Every patient Vance dismissed who later had complications could potentially sue. We're looking at possible malpractice claims, discrimination claims, civil rights violations. The hospital could be named as a defendant for failure to supervise and failure to address known complaints. Margaret asked the critical question. What do we do about the patients who were harmed? I'd been thinking about that since Saturday night. We contact every patient from the complaint files. We offer them free medical evaluation and treatment for any ongoing issues. We apologize, take responsibility, and make it right. Andrew looked nervous. That's an admission of liability. Insurance won't like it. I don't care what insurance likes, I said flatly. Those women were harmed by our employee under our watch. We have a moral and ethical obligation to fix it. We reached a consensus. Dr. Vance would be terminated immediately. His privileges would be revoked. We'd file a report with the state medical board detailing the investigation findings. We'd contact affected patients, offer remediation, and implement new oversight protocols to prevent similar patterns from developing. Then came the hard part. We had to tell Dr. Vance. The termination meeting took place Thursday morning in Margaret Flynn's office. Dr. Vance arrived looking defensive and angry. He sat across from us, arms crossed, radiating resentment. Dr. Lansing delivered the news. Dr. Vance, the peer review committee has completed its investigation into your clinical practices. They found substantial evidence of gender bias, substandard care, and violations of hospital protocols. Your employment is terminated effective immediately, and your medical staff privileges are revoked. Vance's face went red. This is retaliation because of Dr. Reeves's wife. You're targeting me because I didn't recognize who she was married to. I spoke for the first time. This has nothing to do with my wife being my wife. It has everything to do with you dismissing her without examination, without appropriate workup, while she was experiencing a surgical emergency. And it has to do with the 83 other female patients you treated the same way, and the 4 formal complaints that were ignored, and the pattern of bias that put patients at risk. He started to argue. Margaret cut him off. We have documentation, Dr. Vance. Statistical analysis, case reviews, patient complaints, all of it. You're done here. Security will escort you from the building. You have 15 minutes to clean out your locker. He left threatening lawsuits and making accusations. We let him. His threats were empty. The evidence was overwhelming. Claire came home from the hospital on Thursday afternoon. She was recovering well physically, but emotionally she was processing trauma. I kept telling him I was in pain, Michael. I described exactly where it hurt and how bad it was. And he looked at me like I was lying, like I was too stupid to know the difference between real pain and anxiety. I held her while she cried, furious at Vance all over again, furious at a system that had conditioned women to doubt their own experiences, to downplay their symptoms, to apologize for taking up space in emergency rooms. Over the next 2 weeks, we contacted the 4 patients from the complaint files. 3 agreed to meet with us. The first was Ashley Brennan, 29 years old, the woman who'd been sent home by Vance and diagnosed with appendicitis 12 hours later at a different hospital. She sat in my office and told her story. I knew something was seriously wrong. I was in so much pain I could barely stand. But he kept asking if I'd eaten something that disagreed with me, if I was on my period, if I was stressed about work. He made me feel like I was being hysterical. So I went home, and the pain got worse, and I ended up at a different ER where they did a CT scan and rushed me to surgery. My appendix had ruptured. I spent a week in the hospital recovering from peritonitis. She'd filed a complaint with our hospital. It had been reviewed and dismissed as a communication issue. No investigation, no accountability. I apologized to her, explained what we'd discovered about Vance's pattern of bias, offered her free follow-up care for any complications from her delayed diagnosis. She accepted, but her words stayed with me. How many women didn't get a second chance? How many just died at home because a doctor told them they were being dramatic? The second patient was Nina Castillo, 32 years old, misdiagnosed with anxiety when she actually had pericarditis. Her story was almost identical. Vance had spent less than 5 minutes with her, assumed her chest pain was panic attacks, sent her home without an EKG or chest x-ray. She'd ended up at a different hospital the next day when the pain became unbearable and breathing became difficult. I almost didn't go back, she told me, because the first doctor made me feel so stupid for coming to the ER. I thought maybe I was overreacting. My husband insisted we go to a different hospital, and that doctor took one look at me and ordered tests immediately. Saved my life, probably. The third patient was Jessica Ramirez, 26 years old, ovarian torsion. Same pattern, same dismissal, same near-catastrophic outcome. As I listened to these women describe their experiences, I realized this wasn't just about Vance. This was about systemic failure, about a healthcare culture that didn't take women's pain seriously, about oversight mechanisms that ignored patterns because no single case looked egregious enough to trigger intervention. I called a meeting with the entire hospital leadership team, department heads, nursing directors, quality officers, everyone with authority over patient care. We spent 3 hours reviewing what had happened, examining the systemic failures that had allowed Vance's pattern to continue unchecked. The chief of emergency medicine, Dr. Raymond Collis, a 61-year-old physician with 36 years of experience, was defensive at first. We review every complaint. The ones involving Vance didn't rise to the level of gross negligence or patient harm, so we handled them as service recovery issues. I pulled up the complaint files on the screen. 4 women in 1 year complained that their symptoms were dismissed. 1 subsequently diagnosed with appendicitis. 1 with pericarditis. 1 with ovarian torsion. That's not service recovery, Raymond. That's a pattern of dangerous bias that you missed because you looked at each case in isolation instead of identifying trends. He didn't have a good answer. Doctor, Lansing backed me up. We need new protocols, mandatory peer review whenever multiple complaints involve similar issues from a single provider, statistical analysis of testing rates and diagnostic patterns broken down by patient demographics, real-time monitoring of patient outcomes after discharge. We should have caught this months ago. We implemented those changes over the next month, created automated systems to flag physicians whose testing rates or discharge patterns showed statistically significant variation based on patient gender, race, or age, required quarterly review of complaint trends, established an anonymous reporting system for staff to raise concerns about colleague behavior. We also did something unprecedented. We issued a public statement acknowledging that Dr. Vance's pattern of bias had harmed patients, that the hospital had failed to identify and stop it quickly enough, and that we were implementing reforms to prevent similar failures. The statement named the issue directly: gender bias in medical care. It acknowledged that women's pain and symptoms are often dismissed or minimized. It committed the hospital to concrete action. The backlash was immediate. Some physicians accused us of throwing Vance under the bus to avoid liability. Medical organizations criticized us for airing dirty laundry publicly. Insurance companies were furious about the liability exposure. I didn't care. We had failed patients. The right response was transparency and accountability, not covering it up. The state medical board investigation concluded 3 months after Vance's termination. They reviewed all the evidence, interviewed patients, examined his practice patterns. Their finding was unequivocal. Dr. Vance had engaged in unprofessional conduct, demonstrated gender bias in clinical decision-making, and provided substandard care that resulted in patient harm. They revoked his medical license. He couldn't practice medicine in our state. When he tried to apply for license in neighboring states, the discipline followed him. His career in medicine was effectively over. Some people thought the punishment was too harsh. I thought about Claire's gangrenous gallbladder 6 hours from rupture. Thought about Ashley Brennan's ruptured appendix and week-long hospitalization. Thought about Nina Castillo's pericarditis and Jessica Ramirez's ovarian torsion. Thought about how many other women might have suffered or died because of Vance's bias. The punishment fit the harm. 6 months after Claire's surgery, I was invited to speak at a national conference on patient safety and healthcare quality. I told the story of what had happened, not naming Vance specifically but describing the pattern and the systemic failures. The response was overwhelming. Physician after physician approached me sharing similar stories from their own hospitals. Women in the audience told me about times they'd been dismissed by doctors, times they'd been told their pain was anxiety or stress or just hormones, times they'd nearly died because someone didn't take them seriously. One woman, a physician herself, told me she'd had a heart attack at age 42. The first doctor she saw told her it was probably acid reflux. She insisted on an EKG. It showed clear signs of cardiac ischemia. If I hadn't been a doctor, if I hadn't known to push back, I would have gone home and died, she said. We have to do better. We started doing better at Metropolitan General. The new protocols caught 3 other physicians over the next year who showed concerning patterns in their care. Not as egregious as Vance, but problematic enough to trigger intervention. We provided training on implicit bias. We changed how we reviewed complaints. We empowered nurses to advocate for patients when they felt physicians were dismissing legitimate concerns. Patient satisfaction scores improved. More importantly, clinical outcomes improved. We caught more cases of serious illness early because physicians were taking symptoms seriously regardless of patient demographics. Claire recovered fully from her surgery. The physical scars healed within weeks. The emotional scars took longer. She still gets anxious before doctor appointments, still worries that providers won't believe her if she has new symptoms. We're working through it together with a therapist, Dr. Jennifer Wolf, a clinical psychologist with 19 years of experience in medical trauma. Dr. Wolf explained that what Claire experienced was a form of medical gaslighting that can create lasting mistrust of healthcare systems. When someone in a position of authority tells you that your pain isn't real, that you're overreacting or being dramatic, it undermines your confidence in your own perceptions. That's trauma. Claire joined a support group for women who'd experienced similar dismissal in medical settings. Hearing other stories, sharing her own experience, finding community with people who understood, all of it helped her heal. 1 year after her surgery, Claire gave a presentation to our medical staff during their annual training. She told them what it felt like to be in pain, to ask for help, to be dismissed as anxious or dramatic. She described the fear, the self-doubt, the way Vance's attitude made her question whether she was really sick or just weak. She talked about the hours after he sent her away, before I intervened, when she'd been preparing to go home despite the pain because a doctor told her there was nothing wrong, and she challenged every physician in that room. I almost died because Dr. Vance decided my pain wasn't real before he even examined me. I survived because my husband happened to be the medical director, but I shouldn't have needed that connection to receive appropriate care. None of us should. The room was silent when she finished. Several physicians had tears in their eyes. Afterward, 3 female residents approached Claire to thank her for speaking. One said, "I've had patients tell me they didn't believe their pain was serious because previous doctors dismissed them. Now I understand what that does to people. I'm going to do better." That was the whole point. Individual accountability, yes, but also systemic change, cultural transformation, a commitment to believing patients, especially patients who historically haven't been believed. Dr. Vance tried to sue the hospital for wrongful termination. His attorney argued that the investigation was biased, that we'd scapegoated him, that gender disparities in testing rates didn't prove bias. The case was dismissed. The judge reviewed the peer review findings, the statistical evidence, the patient complaints, and ruled that the hospital had substantial justification for termination based on documented performance deficiencies and patient safety concerns. Vance's lawsuit seeking reinstatement and damages was denied. He appealed, lost again, eventually gave up. Last I heard, he was working in medical billing, no longer practicing clinical medicine, angry and bitter about the career he'd lost. I don't feel sorry for him. He had power, and he abused it. He made assumptions that endangered lives. He ignored complaints and continued harmful patterns. The consequences he faced were earned through his own choices. What I do feel sorry about is all the patients who were harmed before we caught him, the women who suffered unnecessarily because our oversight systems failed, the complaints that were dismissed as communication issues instead of investigated as potential patterns, the lack of statistical monitoring that would have flagged his bias months earlier. We can't undo that harm. We can only commit to doing better. Metropolitan General is doing better. Our new protocols have been adopted by 11 other hospitals in our health system. Patient advocacy groups have recognized our transparency and accountability. Medical journals have published our approach as a model for addressing implicit bias in healthcare. But the work is never finished. Bias is insidious, built into systems and cultures, often invisible to people who perpetuate it. We have to stay vigilant, keep questioning our assumptions, keep listening to patients, especially patients whose voices are often dismissed. Claire is my reminder of why that matters. Every time I review a patient complaint, every time I investigate a concerning pattern, every time I have to make a decision about physician performance, I think about her lying in that ER bed in pain while a doctor told her to go home and breathe deeply. I think about how close we came to losing her because someone made assumptions instead of doing his job. And I recommit to making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else on my watch. 2 years after Claire's surgery, we had a daughter. Clara Rose Reeves, born healthy and perfect on a Wednesday afternoon in April. Claire's pregnancy had been monitored carefully, any symptom taken seriously, any concern addressed immediately. Not because she was the medical director's wife, but because that's how every patient should be treated. When Clara was 6 months old, Claire went back to teaching. She talks to her students about advocacy, about trusting themselves, about speaking up when something doesn't feel right. She tells them her story, age-appropriately, about a time she was sick and had to fight to be heard. Some of those students will remember that lesson. Some will advocate for themselves or others when it matters. That's Claire's legacy from a traumatic experience, teaching young people to trust their own voices and demand to be taken seriously. As for me, I'm still medical director at Metropolitan General, still fighting to improve patient safety and healthcare quality, still pushing for transparency and accountability when things go wrong. The work is exhausting and often thankless, but it matters. Every policy we implement, every pattern we catch, every physician we hold accountable, it all adds up to a safer system for patients who deserve nothing less than our best effort. Dr. Vance probably still thinks he was treated unfairly, that the investigation was biased because of my position, that he was scapegoated for systemic problems. He's wrong. He was held accountable for his own choices and his own pattern of harmful bias. The fact that his victim happened to be connected to someone with the power to investigate thoroughly doesn't make the investigation invalid. It just means he finally faced consequences that he should have faced months earlier if our oversight systems had been working properly. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been there that night. If Claire had been just another patient without connections. Would she have gone home like Vance wanted? Would her gallbladder have ruptured? Would she have developed sepsis? Would I have lost her? I'll never know for certain. What I do know is that no patient should need to be married to the medical director to receive appropriate care. No one should have to drop a name or pull rank to be believed when they're in pain. And when systems fail patients, the people running those systems have an obligation to fix them, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it creates liability, even when it means admitting we didn't protect people we should have protected. That's the responsibility we accept when we choose to work in healthcare. To do no harm, and when harm happens anyway, to face it honestly and do better. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.